What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another video. So last week I was hoping to check out this new movie, and yeah, unfortunately here in Florida, all of our theaters and everything was obviously shut down because we had Hurricane Ian come through. And now finally, after a delay of having to go to work for the week and having other things get in the way, it's finally time to talk about Smile. Starring Sosie Bacon, Jessie T. Usher, Kyle Gallner, and Cal Penn, as well as many others, Smile is the both writing and directorial debut of Parker Finn in a feature film and tells the story of a smiling entity that's going from victim to victim. I'm gonna jump straight into this and be honest and say that this, without a doubt, was probably my favorite horror movie going experience that I've had this year, at least in theaters. This isn't my favorite maybe horror film of the year. I'd have to kind of break down all the movies I've seen this year to see how I feel about that. But I am very happy to start off this review by saying that I love this film, and without a doubt, this is easily the most unsettled and uncomfortable and creeped out that I've been in a horror film for quite some time. Now, of course, you're hearing this and the movie's already been out for a little bit and there's been some other reviews on it, and you probably have heard some mixed bag reviews, and that's just going to be the subjective nature of film, right? So I'm definitely curious to hear what people have to say about this right out of the gate. But I will say that I have seen some people call this movie just okay or not good, and I could not disagree more. This movie for me was completely captivating from beginning to end, and what makes this film shine for me is not necessarily its core story, but the execution. This is a film that shines on its execution of familiarity. The story is something we've seen before in different ways, but it has its own spin on it, and the filmmaking techniques that are used here are something that we've seen before as well, but has its own spin on it. And ultimately, what I loved about this film was not necessarily its full-blown originality, but the execution of its own story, utilizing things that we are familiar with. This is not a film that's trying to reinvent the wheel by any stretch of the imagination, but is a movie that takes things that you are familiar with, twists and turns them, does something different with them, and ultimately gives you a really well-executed and well-made film. I am really happy to feel this way about this movie because Smile was probably one of my most anticipated films of the year the closer and closer we got. There was something about the trailer that just drew me in and just seemed unsettling and eerie. If you guys have been following this channel for a while, I am a ginormous horror fan. I'm wearing a slasher shirt right here right now, and yeah, I've covered tons of slashers, horror comedies. I've even covered some black and white films from back in the day like Dracula and The Mummy, and there's plenty others that I haven't yet covered here, things that I grew up loving watching and things that I've yet to see. And so yeah, I love the horror genre, and on a weekly basis I'm always reviewing new movies that are coming out early on the horror streaming service Shudder, and I'm always just checking out new horror films. And there have been plenty of great horror films this year that have been awesome slashers that have the great kills and are like a nice fun adventure with horror elements. There's been the horror comedies like Glorious that takes place in a bathroom and has this, you know, evil god that wants to do some weird stuff in this bathroom, and there's horror elements to that movie, but it's a horror comedy. And I've seen some ghosts and goblins, and I've seen some other things that you're, you know, familiar with seeing in the horror genre this year. I've seen some weird things, some really gripping and engaging horror films that are well paced, like a Barbarian that's entertaining and just kind of has a what the fuck kind of quality to it, but isn't really necessarily scary. And this genuinely was the first time I could think of in 2022 where I found myself really uncomfortable in the chair, and that honestly is something that I chase when it comes to horror. Some people don't like being really scared, but I love it, and it's the reason I think things like haunted houses have always been so popular, and the reason horror films are so popular. There's a jolt you get from that communal experience of just feeling unsettled, and I've always been very creeped out by just simple things when it comes to something that sticks with me for a long term, and it comes really down to faces. If somebody's face is slightly distorted or kind of has an uncanny valley look to it, but isn't necessarily, you know, like a CGI face, something like that, just a real person's face that has some sort of distortion to it, there's something about it that's just unsettling to me. So here you have people just smiling, just simply smiling. But you almost forget how unsettling the wrong kind of smile can really be. And I feel like this film really nails that. If you're going into a movie looking for a creepy smile, this is the one to watch. The core premise here, if you haven't already seen the previews or seen other reviews for it, is that we focus on a woman named Rose, who is a psychiatrist, and she likes to work with people who, you know, have a lot of trauma and issues in their lives, and, you know, mental issues and all these different things like that. And one day she has a young woman who comes into her hospital who is saying that she's seeing things. She's seeing this entity that is smiling at her. It's the most evil smile she's ever seen, and that she feels like she's gonna die, and it keeps telling her that she's going to die. This eventually leads to this young girl seeing something behind our main character Rose, screaming, freaking out, then putting on the creepy smile that she was explaining and killing herself in front of our main character. Now Rose has taken on this entity who she is starting to see in different places. It could be your friend, it could be your family, it can be a random stranger. It really doesn't matter. This individual, this entity is going to mask themselves as them amongst everybody, and nobody else can see them except for you. And as we learn throughout the course of the film, if you end up getting to the end of your run with this creature taking its power over you, you will end up committing suicide in front of somebody else, transferring this power to the next person. And yeah, there was something about that premise when I saw it that I thought was super cool. Is it familiar? Yes, it sounds like It Follows from not very long ago, a good few years ago at this point, and plenty of other films that have a time frame in terms of when you're going to die, something like The Ring. I've heard this film compared to things like It Follows and The Ring on many occasions, and I think in a lot of ways this film definitely kind of merits that kind of comparison. This is a movie that, you know, has a familiar premise that we have seen before, and there were even elements of this film that reminded me of a horror film from a few years ago called Lights Out, that was based on a short little video or short film that came out online. And yeah, you know, this film definitely has familiar elements from all those different places, but where it really shines is in its execution. I found this film to be incredibly well shot, incredibly well performed. I really found that the special effects were great as well, and it utilized very, very minor things to make this film really eerie and creepy, whether it's the camera work or the score of this film, which I found to be really interesting because the score of this film not only utilizes musical composition, small moments of keys and different things like that to get you feeling eerie and creepy throughout the course of the film, but also uses a heavy amount of ambient atmospheric music and sounds to really kind of just give you that unsettled, uncomfortable feel while you're watching it. Again, all of these things, atmospheric noises and sounds and stuff like that in a horror film, we've seen it before. We've seen it a million times. And maybe the theatrical experience really helped it when it came to this movie, but I found that the way that this film was made in terms of its score, its cinematography, its performances, its special effects, all of that for me were really, really solid. You also have really great creepy locations that are used across the film, and even areas and places that typically wouldn't be creepy in a different movie or in a different setting, but because of all of these things working together, the cinematography, the music, the performances, the eerie noises, everything about it, the sound design as well, which I really enjoyed, the way that we transition from scene to scene. A lot of the big jump scares that actually worked in this film were really coming from the sound design. The sound design, the sound mix, the sound editing, all of that when it came to this film for me was really impressive and was a big part of why the scares worked for me. And it really wasn't about having jump scares that were just for the sake of but sometimes the way that we would transition from scene to scene that would have a jump scare in the mix a lot of times really worked because of the sound mix. I also found myself pleasantly surprised that not all the jump scares in this film were completely noticeable as they were coming. Most times, as a horror veteran, as somebody who covers horror here on the channel all the time and is always watching horror, yeah, a lot of times you could just see the jump scare coming from 10 million miles away. And though there were a couple of those in this movie that I did feel that way about, I was happy to say that there was a lot of jump scares in this film that I did not feel this way about. I found myself actually surprised by quite a few of them. And again, I think a lot of that had to go to the sound. I was watching thinking, man, the sound really is the way that they went into that jump scare, not just a loud noise coming, it's the noise before and after and how it transitioned into these jump scares. If you've seen the film, I think you can understand what I'm saying, but I think overall this is a film that used jump scares well. If I was to talk about things that I wasn't crazy about, to be honest, it would be a lot of the side characters. There is a redundancy element to this film at a certain point where we're just focusing on our main character Rose, trying to explain to those in her life what's going on, and them ultimately not believing her and thinking that she's crazy. And so, you know, if you're familiar with horror films and a lot of things that have somebody see something that everybody else doesn't see, you know, you've seen it a million times. They don't believe you. They think you're crazy. I mean, my favorite horror franchise is Chucky, and that's literally what that whole premise is based on. You know, the whole first movie essentially is this little boy trying to tell everybody that his doll is alive and nobody believes him. And that's pretty much how Chucky gets away with everything in every single movie. So, you know, that base premise in so many horror films is done over and over and over again. And so there is a redundancy element to that in this film, where it does feel like, okay, all these side characters aren't really helping our character here. You can understand a couple people not believing her, but at a certain point, it's like, okay, these are the main focal characters, the main characters we're focusing on in terms of side characters, and they're not really serving much of a purpose. Kyle Gallner's character, who plays an ex-boyfriend to our main character in this film, ultimately I think was the best side character and probably the most utilized one in terms of the narrative, and I enjoyed what they did with his character throughout the course of the movie. Yeah, overall, I had a lot of fun with this movie, and a lot of my gripes are pretty minor. I think one of my favorite things about watching a movie that I'm going to review is watching the movie and not really critiquing it in my head until the movie's over. And that's pretty much how I felt about this. Sure, there were a couple of moments that things stood out to me and I go, oh yeah, I definitely want to talk about that, or oh, I'm not sure I like that so much, or okay, maybe I'm realizing the side characters here aren't the greatest. But there was so much about the film that for me was done right that ultimately by the time the movie was over, I thought to myself, okay, great, I wasn't lost in my thoughts about critiquing this film after the fact. I was truly engaged and lost in the movie, and it's been a little bit since I've felt that way 100% when it comes to a horror film that's got me gripped and feeling creeped out. I had goosebumps throughout the entirety of this movie. I'm not gonna lie. I really did love this movie. I had a lot of fun with it. I think it's definitely one of, if not my favorite horror film of this year. Again, I'd have to look at a list and see where it ranks. There's some horror comedy films, which is my favorite subgenre of horror, that I have seen this year that maybe I'd enjoyed a little bit more than this one. But for the most part, there were moments of this film that for me completely gripped me from beginning to end. There were character moments, there are lines of dialogue, there are moments of creepiness and callbacks to other creepy moments from one part of the movie to the next that really worked. I found that the script was strong, I found that the performances were strong, and outside of some side characters that aren't as memorable, at some redundancy and a couple of things that just feel like, oh, maybe they should have cut out 2 or 3 dream sequences, I ultimately found this film to be really engaging from beginning to end, and I think it's going to be one that I definitely remember by the time the year is coming to an end. It's definitely going to be one of those that stands out, and I'm definitely curious to see where this ranks in the year for me. So yeah, Smile. Love this film. I think if you're a fan of horror, you know, everybody has different experiences with horror. There's different things that creep people out. Some people are freaked out by gore. I am 110% not freaked out by gore. Some people are creeped out by monsters. I'm not really creeped out by monsters. Some people are just creeped out by ghosts and ghouls and goblins and demon possession movies. That doesn't freak me out. But there's something about this. There's something unsettling about the Smile. It's something, an image that I can kind of attribute to anybody in my life, anybody that I see around me. And so there's definitely this element of watching this movie and thinking to myself, I just hope that when I close my eyes tonight to go to bed, that I don't have a moment where I'm thinking about the Smile in my head, or that I look in the doorway at night and just start to, you know, let my mind get in the way and start to visualize someone standing there smiling. It's such a simple thing in the horror genre, but it worked. It worked for me in this movie. I found myself really engaged, really creeped out, and I'm very curious to see what other people have to say about this movie. Most people that I've spoken to who also do YouTube seem to have enjoyed the film at least, and some people enjoying it as much as me, but I have seen some people say it was just okay, or they didn't like it, or they thought it was just a rehash of these other premises, which is fair to say, I suppose, but honestly, I couldn't disagree more. I thought this was a really, really well-made film. I thought that the theatrical experience of it, you know, I felt really immersed. I thought that really helped my experience. I think if you're a fan of horror films and you haven't seen a good horror film in theaters in quite some bit, this is probably the one to go check out, just simply because it just kept me on the edge of my seat and made me feel uncomfortable and eerie, and that's kind of something I've been chasing in horror for quite some time, and I can genuinely say I haven't felt that in a horror film in quite some time. But I'll also use me saying that as a way to invite you guys, if there's a horror film that's come out in the last couple of years that maybe I missed, that I haven't covered here on the channel, or that you think would freak me out, maybe something that came out in 2022 that I haven't seen yet, that you think, hey dude, this is the one to watch, this will definitely freak you out, please leave that comment down below. Some people don't like being freaked out in horror. They like kind of like, you know, tame horror. I want to be afraid. I kind of chase that. You know, I'm not really an adrenaline junkie, but if there's a part of me that is an adrenaline adrenaline junkie, is definitely when it comes to horror. I want to feel the uncomfortableness. I want to feel this sense of discomfort and unease while watching a horror film, because ultimately I think that that's the fun of it, right? That's what we want. That's why we go to a haunted house or put ourselves through horror films in general. Though I love horror comedies and I like something that can be big and bonkers and over the top, I love seeing a film like this that really made me feel something. It's like watching a romance. You want to feel invested in that romance, and you kind of want to start falling in love with these characters yourself, right? Yeah, you want that out of any movie. You know, it's like if you watch a movie with a sad scene, you want to be able to cry, right? Like, I feel ultimately if the movie makes you cry, it made you feel something, and it effectively did its job. So in the case of Smile, it freaked me out. I'm definitely creeped out. I had chills on my drive home thinking about it and thinking about some of the smiles. Even the dark space behind me in the car was a little bit freaky, simply because this was a movie that got a little bit in my head just based on something so simple, a smile. And something else I definitely want to mention before I wrap this up is what I didn't know about this film going into it was that it was actually utilizing this whole situation of this evil entity that's, you know, following you and transferring from person to person to talk about trauma, pretty much. This movie is heavily rooted in the concept of trauma eating you alive, killing you from the inside, and how we can tend to take our trauma and throw it onto others, and how that trauma and the things that we do to those around us will affect them for the rest of their lives. And so this is a movie that at its core is about how trauma is almost always with us and lives with us. And for those who have very serious trauma, who have suffered throughout their lives and have, you know, emotional issues or mental issues, this movie definitely leans heavy into the concept that if you have trauma in your life, it's going to linger with you like this dark entity. And I thought that was an interesting metaphor to throw in there as well. I'll stop rambling now. A big thanks to you guys for watching. As you can tell, I enjoyed the movie, and I definitely want to hear what you guys have to say, and definitely give me more recommendations of really creepy movies of this year. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.